The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by Ski Sundown in nearby New Hartford, Connecticut, offering skiing and snowboarding 7 days and nights a week until 10 p.m. Ticket and lesson information at skisundown.com. Winter made better. The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by Window World of Western Mass, a local family business with experienced craftsmen offering vinyl, composite, and James Hardie siding. WindowWorldofWesternMA.com.
Welcome to the Fabulous 413. I'm Khalees Smith.
And I'm Monty Belmonte. Later in the show, musician, educator, and film producer Fabiola Mendez joins us in studio to talk about Puerto Rico's national instrument, the Cuatro. And maybe we just might be able to get her to play that instrument live.
Ooh, and we'll also have a visit from a local luthier who's been teaching folks about Puerto Rican musical culture and making cuatros and guitars in the Valley for half a century, including one for Fabiola, William Cumpiano.
And we'll talk to some of the people that have brought Fabiola here to the Valley. But first, you might have heard how DEI programs and initiatives are being excised from federal departments.
But you may not know about the agency that helped those programs to see the light.
We know someone who can help with that. It's time for another one of our usually monthly segments with Dr. Usman Power Green, professor of history at Clark University in Worcester, Northampton's own Dr. Usman Power Green. But we're quadrupling down on the power of history this month. And one of the things that many people have been seeing in the news relates directly to historical acts in this country. Yep. The EEOC, the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the potential that that office may not exist in the way that it has previously. In addition, anything having to do with DEI being scrubbed from official websites in the federal government. Now, I saw an interesting post the other day on social media saying, anytime anybody criticizes DEI, please make them say, I am against diversity, equity, and inclusion, as opposed to giving it DEI, which almost obfuscates what's actually going on here. The EEOC was created as a way to give people opportunities to diversify the workforce and more. Let's hear a little bit about the history of the EEOC, Dr. Usman Power Green.
Yeah, so I mean, the foundations for what we think about as diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so the programs really does go back to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I mean, so many of us, when we think about the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement, we just had MLK Day. We sort of look at the efforts to deal with public accommodations, right? So segregation on buses and what people often see as very visual markers of discriminatory policies. But what we often don't think as much about maybe is the sort of ways in which the Civil Rights Act of 1964 also dealt with employment discrimination, right? And how we think about our society and labor force and how we think about trying to, as best as our nation, our society can, to get rid of the vestiges or the elements of racist policies that actually prevented African Americans from employment in certain capacities. Some of that goes back even to some executive orders under Roosevelt in the early 40s in terms of discrimination in the federal workforce. What we saw during the Civil Rights Movement is the sort of federal government acknowledging that these long traditions that have prevented African Americans from employment need to end. And then the question is, how do you go about doing it besides just an act? And this is where the EEOC, right, this commission was established. So
what were some of the early things that the EEOC did to open up those avenues, to take it from more of just an aspirational idea to something that could really happen on the ground?
Yeah, one of the most important outgrowths was a notion which is oftentimes misunderstood, and that notion is affirmative action.
Right.
And the reason why, again, some people listening, when they think of it, they may, oh my gosh, it's they somehow see it as negative, but really it was just a way of thinking about how can a business, or in the case of the federal government specifically, go about actively seeking to deal with injustices in terms of hiring practices. And so that is going to impact, going back to the 60s to present, all of the sort of recruiting programs, going to, for example, the historically black colleges and making people aware of government positions. Really, when you go back to and you look at the policies that came under this idea of affirmative action, these are policies that tried to get elements of the government to go into communities and attempt to actively make sure people are aware of opportunities, as opposed to sort of hiring people based on their race or their gender or whatever. It really was laying out clearly to other government entities that we are going to show the ways in which we're attempting to deal with inadequacies that have been historical. So there's a whole slew of them. Those that are really interested can go to the EEOC's website and look at the sort of history of this and all the different ways in which they've attempted to deal with this tiny numbers of African Americans and other minorities and women, women as well, in the federal workforce.
It's still there right now. So
I was wondering if it was going to be actually.
You can still look at it currently. It is still available online. And I think one of the important things that you brought up with mentioning affirmative action is the gender aspect of it, which people often undervalue because in looking at data across decades, the group that benefits the most from affirmative action is women, and actually kind of specifically white women. But it's always seen as something that is meant as an equalizer for ethnic minorities, even though that's not necessarily the case. It does help, but that's not the group that actually got the biggest boost from this.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the episodes previously, we talked about Shirley Chisholm and her presidential run. And so when we think about, by the time you get to the 70s particularly, and the women's liberation movement, and within the public sector, Shirley Chisholm's run for president absolutely reflects this effort to really force the government and other entities to really realize the way in which discrimination based on gender has functioned to prevent women from being candidates. And so, I certainly trace the evolution of the Civil Rights Act to the establishment of the EEOC, to efforts specifically to think more clearly about diversity around gender, to people like Shirley Chisholm into the 70s and into the 80s. We saw a much broader expansion in the 80s to include LGBTQ communities and even religious groups. And so by the 80s, you have this idea of diversity and inclusion that was, sort of established during the civil rights movement, a major force in broader social life, and how we think about the value of having a diverse group of people, either at your school, in your community, or in your workplace.
We're talking a little bit about the history and impact of the EEOC in light of the Trump administration's effort to dismantle some of these programs. They've fired some officers that have worked at EEOC. There's sort of an anti-DEI purge taking place right now. We're speaking with Dr. Usman Power Green in one of our regular segments, The Power of History. And I know you're a historian and not a statistician or a mathematician. And impact is one of the things that I think people like to hear about. And maybe we'll learn more about this as we're all weighing and learning about the history of EEOC and the future of EEOC, perhaps even more importantly in some ways. But is there anything that you do know or want to share about some of the ways that EEOC has had an impact since it was established in the early part of the 60s?
Yeah, I think that one of the major impacts that all of this work around ensuring that we think as broadly as possible about the ways in which discrimination functions has to do with the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in the 90s. Oftentimes we forget, that, the reason we have so many ways which we think about our physical space, whether it's buildings, whether it's schools, and we have to think about that we have a diverse group of students, diverse group of potential employees and potential customers that have some different needs that need to be taken seriously. And so I certainly see the establishment of the American Disabilities Act, directly related to this broad question, right? And that question is, do we want a society, a nation, a society that truly allows for equity? Not equality, not we're all equal or whatever, but just that it's equitable given people's circumstances. So, that's one, to me, instrumental and transformative policies that really have changed the scope of our nation and obviously employment and education. So that'd be one example of the outgrowth that I think people may not think so much about.
And diversity when it comes to disabilities has also been under threat in some, at least the rhetoric that has been coming out of the new administration. Universities is another place where this plays in as a major factor. We've heard from the president of Mount Holyoke College that they are not going to dismantle their DEI programming, and they're being very vocal about it. I think some of the other 5 colleges in the area maybe are being more measured in how they're responding to it, maybe not as forthcoming. And other colleges and universities and institutions across the country are actively adhering what the Trump administration is asking them to do and dismantling some of these policies. I know you're not a spokesperson for Clark University, but what has the administration of Clark University, where you teach, Dr. Usman Power Green, said about these things, if anything?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, Clark University is a private university. So that's one thing for listeners to, when we think about these policies and their impact, right? So there's public universities, private universities, the impact on public universities, given the fact that the centralized nature of them and state governors and state administrations decisions can happen quick, fast in terms of what people can teach and what policies are going to be funded by state government. So it's much more direct path. For the private universities, one of the challenges that has really impact us at Clark and many universities that people might not be aware of is the declining enrollment of students, right? Declining enrollment of students, and in some cases that results in the bottom line, right? In terms of how much revenue universities have. And so the challenge that Clark faces and other universities is a question about the impact of having individuals in positions designated as such. For many universities, Clark included, we did not have a chief officer of diversity and inclusion. This was work that, we had committees, which I was on before it was created, communities of diversity and inclusion, where university faculty partnered with, the provost and others in order to execute the goals with the plan, with their DEI plan. And so some of this transformation is less politically driven in private universities and much more a factor of the shrinking university and the ways in which universities that expanded rapidly are now having to second guess where they put their money. And so this is something that is, a real concern at Clark and a real concern across the nation, for all universities that are having to deal with a decreasing pool of young people in terms of choosing to go to universities and those universities that are tuition based. So I happen to be in a moment, and I know colleagues out there, and I do trace it back to the beginning of Black Lives Matter, where there was a huge upsurge. So we're looking at, for those that aren't aware, again, younger listeners, 2015-ish, really, I think, Michael Brown, and, 2014, 2015, that academic year, centers being created, Center for Race and Area Studies and Gender. And these things really emerged, and it's been about a decade, and all of us are left, as always, every 10 years or so, or 20 years, asking, how can we do the same work we're doing in a way that's more efficient? Some of us question some of those questions of efficiency, but at the same time, this is a reality. So that's sort of where we are. And as I said, this is a national phenomenon among private institutions, as well as public, but certainly private institutions.
Do you feel like that shrinking might roll over into general offerings too? Is the shrinking and removal of DEI going to remove those possibilities of people even offering Black history, Latin history, gender-based studies of accessibility throughout the ages? Do you feel like they might end up mirroring each other?
Yeah, actually, I think the issue of our society, right, broadly speaking, non-college bound students being able to learn Black history, for example, it's Black History Month, being able to learn about various diverse groups is going to return in earnest to community organizations, community education, where entities that are not in public schools, for example, are doing work in the community to educate people. And that's how it was for a very, very long time. Some of it was instituted in schools where you had certain courses taught on Black history or women's history in public schools, which is extraordinary for younger people to access that. But in terms of universities, I anticipate maybe the opposite might happen, right? If you come from a state where DEI has been cut and there's no African-American history or women's history or history of Latinos, in America, as a class I know colleagues teach in public schools, when you come to a university, you're going to be even more hungry for that, right? Because it's something that you just didn't have. You just had U.S. history and maybe U.S. history that doesn't, as our president said in his most recent memo, doesn't, talk about anything negative about our country. It's unpatriotic history. If you live in a place that is a school, as elementary school or middle school, or high school, you will come to Clark University, shameless plug, and you will have access to extraordinary professors professors in the Center for Gender, Race, and Area Studies who will help fill in those gaps and make you the type of educated person that understands the world in diverse ways when you graduate and you get a job in corporate America. There are going to be expectations of things that you understand and know if you go to university, and places like the Center at Clark will certainly still be here to do that work because, that has not been rolled back, to teaching those things, as opposed to sort of these other positions that are designated DEI positions. Some of that's rolled back, but not the faculty.
And it seems like a continuation of something that we keep mentioning in these segments about becoming more comfortable with the uncomfortable things that we have done as a people might be at the root of some of this, because if we're not supposed to say anything negative about the country, then that in itself is also erasure. Absolutely.
And people fought very hard to have us spend time acknowledging past wrongs. One of the things I teach an adult history class in Springfield, and with our adults, we were just talking about the ways in which, beginning with Reagan into Clinton into Bush, we acknowledge the wrongs of Japanese internment, and so presidents, politicians have consistently embraced, from President Biden acknowledging the Tulsa massacre and really talking about that. This has been a very important part of our history, has been presidents and political figures actually acknowledging wrongs of the past and then asking that question, like, how can we repair? And so this idea that somehow to talk about elements of our history that maybe we're not as proud of is somehow undermining the integrity. I think it's the exact opposite. I think that our nation is stronger because we're able to face wrongs from the past and attempt to make real gains. And I'm a huge believer in that. And I disagree with our current president on that one.
It sounds just like a thing a historian would say.
Exactly. Who teaches Black history, right?
Coming up, more of the power of history with Professor Usman Power Green. We'll hear about the power of the dollar that may keep many DEI programs afloat.
Later in the show, Cuatroista, filmmaker and educator Fabiola Mendez joins us, along with luthier and educator William Cumpiano.
You're listening to the Fabulous 413 on 88.5 NEPM.
The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by UMass Amherst School of Public Policy. Admissions now open for graduate programs in 2025. Learn how to become a changemaker at umass.edu/SPP.
Dr. Usman Power Green is our regular guest here in the Fabulous 413, usually our monthly guest, but we're quadrupling down this month with the professor from Northampton, talking today about EEO and DEI and all of those things that may be MIA from the federal government.
More acronyms.
Yeah, you just throw more letters out there.
This confuses the people.
Well, what I found interesting, sort of doing research for the segment and looking into on the business side of things, as opposed to federal government and schools, is the DEI industry really emerged in the 2000s, in earnest, right? So you have many professionals, it's actually a profession and it's a marketplace, but projections, and this is from an article written in Forbes magazine, is that, by 2030, the DEI industry, right, which, some people are critical of, others find it essential when they can't hire a person individually to go to some of these organizations and businesses that actually provide this work, fantastic workshops for institutions, religious institutions, faith-based institutions, and schools. From a business perspective, Forbes anticipates a 12.6% growth in DEI to $24.4 billion by 2030, right? So, while there is a backlash and there's certainly a shakeout in the public sector, and universities and schools are rethinking initiatives as in terms of the for-profit world, and the reality that these businesses that have been established by really incredible people and thinkers and activists to actually provide a quality and professional approach to diversity and inclusion that takes seriously the history and the goals. This is something that corporate America might be doing quietly, but continues to see as valuable. And so, we haven't seen corporations, for example, cutting their programs or their trainings as much as maybe we would think would happen, and the same way that's happening, say, in the federal sector, right, or in states that are doing this. So I don't know if people want to see that as good news, but it is a reflection that sometimes these shakeouts or backlashes are really something that can have an impact. But when DEI, now that DEI has been institutionalized in the business world, even if businesses shrink and things change, they seem to still be valued, let's just say, as important aspects of having diverse population of people you hire and making, selling to a diverse group of people to buy your product.
I'm surprised at that, considering the news that's come out about Target and Amazon regarding Black creators and how they're stalking them this season, especially during the middle of Black History Month. But everyone seems to think that private sector will take over and continue the run if we get rid of it in the federal sphere. But that kind of forgets why we needed it in the federal sphere to begin with.
Yeah. What we do know is that the history of either equal opportunities, ideas about diversity, that historically has been a movement that has actually has it made some of the gains that many people believe, where we're at now as opposed to 2000, 25-year arc, maybe not in some areas, right? But at the same time, what we have seen is we've seen a view by sort of our social history, right? Our cultural history, that this has become something that overall the majority of people in businesses, in schools and universities, all throughout the public and private sector see as valuable. There always were a percentage of people that saw it as historically not valuable, right? And that percentage might go up, it might go down, but it seems to me that the vast majority see it as valuable. And I think that where I get caught is not understanding that some of these laws and policies, particularly around voting, right, in a different realm, were put there for a reason. And the moment they were pulled away in terms of these other realms of society, people went, in positions of power, think in North Carolina specifically, people in positions of power acknowledged that immediately once the federal law, the sort of removal of some of the Voting Rights Act, immediately there was efforts to recreate policies and practices that deny people the right to vote. And this is the North Carolina State Supreme Court that has chastised their legislators for doing that. So, I do think that it's important to understand historically the origins of some of these policies and the desire to have them as a feature of our society in terms of our job or whatever it is, because ultimately we viewed the absence of them to create massive inequalities that impacted everybody. And if they didn't impact everybody, it would have been always hard to have them go through. But they impacted everybody negatively. And there is the view that even if broad and not as precise sometimes, that it is generally a positive thing because of workplace culture, which people take seriously. And also university culture, school culture.
Yeah,
these are things people take seriously now.
There's a similar threat with issues taken with Title IX for the education front of it. And we'll see how that plays out also.
And again, there's always a group of people historically that are adamant against whatever the policy move is, whatever the decision to allocate resources or spend money on. Like, there's always a group of people that say that that's a waste of money, or that, things are equitable, or, when it comes to sort of women in sports, for example, right? But it's also been historically the case that really important figures that have a lot to lose have taken a stand and have had a major impact on having us rethink what diversity and equity really is. And this is something that, hopefully our whole entire nation is very proud of, particularly in the last, 5-6 years or so.
And ready to take the reins on because we're getting them.
That's right.
Dr. Usman Power Green talking a little bit about the history and impact of EEO and DEI with us as the Power of History segment quadruples for the month of February with our professor from Northampton, professor of history at Clark University in Worcester. Thanks so much, Dr. Usman Power Green.
Yeah, no problem. The conversation.
For parts Trace and Cuatro of the show, we'll learn about the Cuatro.
Musician, educator, and film producer Fabiola Mendez and local luthier William Cumpiano join us to explore the culture, sounds, and ongoing legacy of Puerto Rico's national instrument, the Cuatro.
That's next. You're listening to the Fabulous 413 on 88.5 NEPM.
The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by the UMass 5 College Credit Union, offering co-op advantage checking with cash back on all purchases, plus secure debit card controls, all from the UMass 5 mobile banking app. Insured by NCUA, umass5.coop.
Welcome back to the Fabulous 413, and what you're hearing right now is music from our next guest, cuatrista Fabiola Mendez. Fabiola Mendez is a Puerto Rican cuatrista, singer, educator, and Emmy-nominated composer. Her artistic vision and original music focus on the exploration of her culture, her ancestry, and her identities.
Native to Puerto Rico, Fabiola began playing the Cuatro, Puerto Rico's national instrument, at 6. She got her early music training at the Antonio Paoli School of Music in Caguas and her bachelor's in music from Berklee College of Music, where in 2018 she made history as the first graduate to play the Puerto Rican Cuatro as the principal instrument.
We are also joined by local luthiering legend William Compiano, who's been crafting cuatros, guitars, and other stringed instruments under his own moniker since 1974. His work has been displayed at the American Crafts Museum and the Smithsonian. He's dedicated to educating the greater public about luthiership and the musical traditions of Puerto Rico, having published books and produced films on these subjects.
And we hear tell that William Compiano has in fact made a cuatro for Fabiola Mendez, but they've never met in person before today, so we're rectifying that.
Is that true? You've never met before today?
We met last time she played in Florence at the Bombyx.
Okay.
And no, I haven't made a cuatro for her yet.
So all rumor and conjecture.
I'd love to, but
We're speaking things into the universe.
Yes, and we are also joined by two of the folks responsible for bringing Fabiola to Springfield, Marcos Carreras from the Springfield Conservatory for the Arts and Kristen Neville from Blues to Green.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Yes. Now, the cuatro. Well, I think we were mispronouncing it because it didn't sound like it would be the name of the instrument, because cuatro is a number.
That's right.
So tell us, William, who creates these, what makes a cuatro a cuatro?
Well, every culture cherishes its own set of icons, and usually, often, they're trivial and seemingly inconsequential, but they really go to the heart of the people. I'm thinking of the Canadian maple leaf and American baseball and apple pie. But something that's been happening to colonized people all over the world is that they cherish their musical instruments as symbols and icons of their uniqueness. And obviously the Scots have a bagpipe, and whenever you think of Scotland, you think of the bagpipe. And the Irish have their harp. And I understand in some regions of Japan, the koto is considered an icon, which this stands in the place of Japanese people. It's like a symbol. Mm-hmm. Well, the cuatro has stood by the Puerto Ricans for 500 years, and so has become a cultural icon. And although it's gone through periods of adoration and forgetfulness, it's most of it, the Puerto Ricans don't know why the cuatro is called a cuatro, even though it has 10 strings.
Right.
And because this history and other history was neglected for so many centuries because the colonizer didn't have any interest in pursuing it, about 25 years ago, we decided to do a kind of amateur historiography of the cuatro. And 25 years later, we have all the things that about the cuatro, and it's which we place on our page, which is the Cuatro Project page. So that's what happened. Now, to answer the question, which everybody wants to know, how come it has only 10 strings if it's called a cuatro? It's because, well, nobody knows why. We know by inference. We know by inference that in the 15th century there was a small 4-string instrument in Spain that was tuned in a particular way, la, mi, la, re, and it had 4 strings, and they're plucked. Well. Modernity hit Spain like it hits everything, and that cuatro, which was called cuatro there in Spain, was relegated to the lower classes, and that's what happens a lot in culture, is that the habits of the upper class get loaned to or given to the lower classes, and they run with them. I can only think of the witches with the pointy hats. So that's how the witches were all lower class, but they were wearing the fashions that were popular among the elites a century before. Well, that's what happened. The Cuatro remained. This rustic Cuatro remained up in the hands of peasant classes, while the elites, the instruments evolved in the form that they got more strings. They were, instead of being made by carving, which was actually a way you do what you do when you don't have fancy saws and things like that, the Spanish instruments evolved. But what happened then comes the colony, 16th century, and we have records of string instruments coming in. We actually found the records that of instruments, which instruments and by whom and how what the tax was, and all that stuff. But we didn't find anything about a cuatro. There were vihuelas and guitars of different kinds, but no cuatros. But then the cuatro appears on the countryside, and we think it was probably in the backpacks of soldiers and travelers and agricultural workers that were transferred from the Canary Islands to Puerto Rico, and that's what actually was the start of the colony. And so it evolved in a four-string instrument called a cuatro that was tuned in this really ancient way. Then what happened was there's another process in musicology where a culture becomes encapsulated, where among the poor people in remote areas, those old traditions remain, while in the cities, everything evolves into newer and newer forms. Well, that's what happened in Puerto Rico. The peasant farmers played their four-string cuatro, while the people in San Juan and the cities in Ponce were listening to opera, and they had pianos, and they were playing Spanish guitars, and they were playing all this stuff like that. But the cuatro was in the hinterlands, was still being played there. Well, what happened in Spain during that period was that the cuatro had evolved into a 10-string metal string instrument in Spain. And there was, at the middle of the 19th century, a great furor, a craze, where these groups of plectrum orchestras started coming in from Spain and Italy, called estudiantinas. And they were a huge hit all over Latin America and the United States, to the extent that if you can find these plectrum orchestras in every city, every major city in the United States, these large plectrum orchestras with all playing instruments with doubled up metal strings. And it was such a furor that it also made a huge hit, that concept of metal doubled up strings, that it also engulfed all of Latin America. And the same thing that happened to the cuatro happened in Latin America, in the instruments of Latin America, was that a new cuatro was born with five paired metal strings.
Let me interrupt you right there for a quick second. We're speaking with luthier William Cumpiano, who's been making guitars and cuatros in the Valley now for decades and decades. It's the traditional instrument of Puerto Rico, and we are also joined in the studio by a cuatro player of renown, Fabiola Mendez. Did you want to say a little more about the history of that?
Well,
William?
yeah. Well, bringing it up to the modern times, well, it happened in Cuba, where their folk instrument emerged with doubled up metal strings, and it happened all over South America and Latin America. All their old ancient rustic instruments got metal strings. And a new cuatro was born mostly in the northern coast, where a lot of the cities are. And for 50 years in the 20th century, both instruments survived together. The 10-string cuatro, it was called a cuatro because that was the moniker that was given, like Fred or Joe or Joe. While the original cuatro persisted in the mountainous center of the island where the peasant farmers were. So that's as closely as I can do it, the panorama of what
you did
we have
500
now.
years of history very quickly,
Cuatro,
comparatively
because
speaking.
of the fact that the arts were not supported, except by the elites in Puerto Rico. The Cuatro disappeared several times, and there have been several resurgences of the Cuatro. But that's all over now. The Cuatro is experiencing a golden age, and everybody plays a Cuatro, and everybody loves a Cuatro. And I have a page on my Cuatro website that has the Cuatro now belongs to the world. I call that page because we have Irish players, we've got rock and roll players, we've got people in Bristol, we have Czechoslovakian guy playing, we've got dozens and dozens of people, and they're getting new sounds of the Cuatro that was never heard before, but they were playing the Cuatro. And now everybody has embraced the Cuatro, and the Cuatro right now is, and Fabiola is a beneficiary of this great craze that Puerto Ricans have, especially when the whole issue of nationality is in play here, that it's theirs, and it's not, it's ours, and we did it. We made them.
We literally have Fabiola embracing a Cuatro in the studio right
We should
now.
hear her play it.
I think we should as well. Would you please grace us with a tune on the Cuatro, Fabiola?
Absolutely. This tune I'm going to play is one of the oldest aguinaldos, traditional melodies from the world of folk music in Puerto Rico. This is called Aguinaldo Jíbaro.
Ay, lole, lolay, lolay, la, lole, la, flora campesina con güiros tambores. Flora campesina con güiros tambores, de luz y colores, prende la colina. El ritmo domina el mágico Edén y exalta también cadencia y paisaje. En cada paraje de mi boriquén, en cada paraje de mi boriquén. Campesina, ritmo vegetal, como un festival que no se termina. La alegría germina en frutos también, de lejos se ven músicos cantores, regalando flores a mi boriquén, regalando flores a mi boriquén.
Que chévere, as we would say.
Que chévere. Fabiola Mendez playing the Cuatro and giving us all a history lesson in practice with that instrument that William Cumpiano, who has been creating these instruments, gave us in voice, in words.
Frankly, answering all of the questions that I had about playing it while you were playing it, because like it's a smaller body, but the neck goes like way up, and like outside of the body, there's maybe only like 8-9 frets.
That's correct.
But then there's like 20, it looks like you got maybe 21 total. So like playing way up on the neck just looks like it would be hard.
Yeah, you don't have a cutaway like a Fender Stratocaster where you can get way up there and Eddie Van Halen it or whatever.
Yeah.
How did you encounter the Cuatro, Fabiola? I mean, you're from Puerto Rico, but I mean,
Yes.
there's any number of instruments and musical genres that you could have been drawn to.
That's correct. I always say it's because of my family. My dad used to play the cuatro, and in my grandmother's house, I always remember seeing cuatristas, seeing cuatro players and trovadores, the singers of this traditional music, especially around the holiday time. So when I was 6 years old, I grabbed my dad's cuatro. They tell me this story, and I started trying to imitate, the musicians that I would see at my grandmother's house and of course at all the festivities. So my parents said, do you like the cuatro? Let's just get some cuatro lessons and see where this goes. And as you can imagine, there used to be, and there still is a little bit, but back in the day it was pretty strong that this instrument was only for the people in the countryside. Mm-hmm. As William was sharing, the peasants, the lower class families, and sadly, viejitos, as we say, the elders. So for a young, a child, I was 6 years old, to play the cuatro was not very common at the time. And to bring my instrument to school, and I would play at different events in the school, my friends would always make fun of me.
Really?
They would just say, "That's so lame that you're playing the cuatro. That's for old people." So you can imagine, that sadly, even though it's a Puerto Rican instrument, there was this perception. But thankfully, I was able to join a group of children that also were learning how to play cuatro on the east side of the island in a town called Humacao. And that's what I started learning my first songs and learning how to read music. And eventually I went to a formal music school in Puerto Rico where I learned more theory and more repertoire to then be able to audition for Berklee College of Music. And I always say that since I was in middle school, I knew that I wanted to make music, my career. And more than my career, it's my life's mission. And to share the love for this instrument, and through the love for this instrument, help people connect with their own stories and with their own cultures. So very blessed to have this piece of wood that I always called my master wood, my teacher and my companion, my escudo.
Shield.
Yes. You work in education too, like you do a lot of outreach, and not to mention doing music for a certain PBS show. But do you encounter those sentiments about the cuatro when you go out to teach, to engage with youth now?
Absolutely. I think there's a value in when we're listening to these instruments. I was just meeting with the students at the Springfield Conservatory where I'm doing a residency for these days. And one of the students was listening to the cuatro, and they said, "It sounds like folk music. It sounds like a folk instrument." And there's something about the power of these instruments that connect us all beyond just me saying, "I'm from Puerto Rico, and this instrument is from Puerto Rico." It's connected because our stories are connected through the period of colonization and, of course, everything that happened in the Americas. But hearing, a young generation listen to these instruments and find them cool, it's definitely something that I'm grateful for. Because, again, when I was growing up, it wasn't cool.
This might be the dumbest question, but Bad Bunny's new album is a way to harken back to the traditional music of the island of Puerto Rico.
That's
is the
correct.
cuatro on the album?
The cuatro is on the album.
That's amazing.
And not only the cuatro, but then also
the percussion instrument.
the percussion instrument and two other string instruments that we have in the island that are the tiple and the bordonua. Those two are part of the cuatro, the family of strings in Puerto Rico.
So you got good company making it cool, too.
And if we're talking about strings and a number of them not necessarily making sense with the name, the tiple sometimes has 3, sometimes has 5, sometimes has 8 or 10 strings. So, the name is the name.
Exactly.
Well, we need to take a little break here, but hopefully we'll be able to squeeze in another cuatro song from our cuatrista, Fabiola Mendez, who is performing in residency with the Springfield Conservatory. You're listening to the Fabulous 413 on 88.5 NEPM.
The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by Northeast Solar, offering solar options, energy security, and solutions for the local community. Learn more at northeast-solar.com.
Welcome back to the Fabulous 413. We are joined in the studio by cuatrista Fabiola Mendez, as well as luthier who makes cuatros, this traditional Puerto Rican instrument, making them here in the Valley, William Cumpiano, and Marcos Carreras from the Springfield Conservatory for the Arts, who have welcomed Fabiola in a master class over the last few days. How have the kids reacted to Fabiola and playing the instrument, Marcos?
It's a magical opportunity for our students to make the connection not only with Fabiola bringing it to life, but they were able to actually now identify through her demonstrations what songs they listen to currently on the radio. For example, you mentioned Bad Bunny's latest album, and actually be able to go song by song and making that correlation. And they weren't able to do that before. And this is our national instrument. And for many of them, it was the first time ever seeing it live. So thanks to blues2green.org and Chris and Neville making this opportunity possible, we are blessed to have our students be able to share this time with Fabiola and her amazing artistry with our kids.
So cool.
It is cool.
Let's hear it again.
Let's hear it again.
All right, this next song is an original of mine. It's part of my newest album, and it's called Canción de Amor, a song of love.
Esto es una canción de amor pa'l que se fue, pa'l que tiene que ocultar su soledad. Esto es una canción pa' quienes sueñan, que buscan más allá del fin del mar. Esto es una canción de amor pa'l que se fue a encontrar en sus memorias el andar, el recuerdo de los viejos y su sabiduría. No hay destino sin caminar. Esto es como un sobo, abuela, olor a recao recién picao, el abrazo de mi tierra que me da la bendición. Canción de amor pa'l que se fue a buscarse en otros nidos y sembrar, pa'l que ha visto su cosecha y a los que a diario luchan, ellos dedico mi cantar. Esto es como un sobo, abuela, olor a recao recién picao, el abrazo de mi tierra que me da la bendición. Esto es como un sobo, abuela, olor a recao recién picao, el abrazo de mi tierra que me da la bendición.
Fabiola Mendez on the Cuatro here on the Fabulous 413.
Okay, so very quickly, because we're nearing the end of the show, but both of you have worked in film to bring some of your passion and your love for this instrument and your people to screen. What was different about working in that medium? Because it's not your usual medium at all. We'll start with you, William. What was it like working on film and bringing like some of the culture onto film?
Well, you must mean in video.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I held the microphone. This was a very rustic. We got our feet dirty. We went up into the hills with a microphone and a guy with a
Tape recorder?
Tape recorder?
It was a videotape recorder. They used cassettes at that time.
Yeah.
The Super 8, it was called. And we put together it was more like 60 hours of interviewing all the old cuatristas and interviewing the makers and interviewing all the educators that taught and had something to say about the Cuatro. And to me, it was a wonderful experience. I mean, it put me back into to contact with my own Puerto Ricanness, because I come from a mixed, bilingual and bicultural. My mother's a Boston Jew, and my father is a Puerto Rican Catholic. So what it did was it reconciled that schizophrenia in me. It was very, very wholesome.
Let's give the last minute to Fabiola and your experience in bringing it to film.
So it's beautiful to work on the animated world of Alma's Way. She
Shout
is
out to PBS.
a Puerto Rican girl on the Bronx, and I get to write the music for the show and play the cuatro and play some Puerto Rican drums as well. So it's beautiful because it's portraying on screen what we truly are as a culture and as a people.
It's amazing, and you are in residency right now, so there's not a lot of open public performances for Fabiola, but you are playing the Museum of Fine Arts at the end of February in Boston, if you want to make the trek out to Boston. And William Cumpiano's project about the Cuatro, if your internet security doesn't block you from seeing it, like for some reason it does here in this building, is Cuatro, Cuatro-PR.org, and you can find out more about this incredible history and the work that William has done in preserving it, and going into the next generation with Fabiola, and even the next generation with the kids at the Springfield Conservatory and Marcos Carreras. Thank you for letting us know that she would be in town and welcoming. We're happy to welcome you to the Fabiola 413, as we're going to call it.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes.
She's been sitting on that
Thank you.
The whole show. On the next Fabiola 413, we're going to bring you sweet things with an adventure deep into the hill towns to talk ice cider and more at Headwater Cider with brewer Peter Mitchell.
And a little of the science helping the apples happen with Elizabeth Garofalo of UMass Extension, and then chocolate, because chocolate is awesome, and there's great chocolate makers in Northampton, it turns out. I'm Clee Smith.
I'm Monty Belmonte.
We'll see you tomorrow on the Fabulous 413.